What is this craziness? That's right, physical cards, unsleeved. It can mean only one thing. It's deck tech time. All right, it's been a long time since I've done one of these. I think the last one I did was the Kess deck, dating all the way back to the release of the Hull Breacher. And since then, I haven't actually been playing a ton of Magic. Certainly been thinking about it a lot, collaborating still, just not putting in a lot of time with the game. But that doesn't mean that I'm not still engaged with the Commander format and still don't care about it. And about 2 months ago, actually, my good friend Nate Prodzik, if you're watching my channel, you're likely familiar with him, sent me a very long series of irate messages about his attempts to get his Breya deck to work properly in the contemporary format online, and really expressing his frustration with a bunch of key cards and some certain key commanders, with the partner mechanic, kind of with just a whole host of crazy power creep things that have come along in the last couple of years that have really spoiled the format to an extent for competitive players who want to kind of go their own way and play decks that aren't intrinsically unfair. And after hearing him out over the span of actually several days of this frustration, seeing lots of screenshots and stuff of him just having hopeless board states by the second or third turn of the game, I made a suggestion. I said, well, let's just put our heads together and let's build one of these degenerate, insane decks and see how we can do with it, because I'm pretty sure that our mutual brain trust can probably come up with something that's at least as good, if not better, than the kind of decks that are giving you major problems. And we thought about that a little bit. I slapped together a prototype deck, and Nate was willing to put in the reps, and put in the reps he did. He spent roughly the last 2 months or so fine-tuning this deck, and I've probably played it at this point maybe 200 games or so. I certainly have not put in anywhere near the work that Nate has, but the two of us working together on it, getting some suggestions from other friends of us, have pretty much assembled what I can confidently say is the strongest deck I think that we've ever built in the Commander format. And I don't say that easily. I mean, that's stacked up against decks like Breya, like Nin the Pain Artist, obviously decks like that degenerate Kess deck, and my Zur deck as well. But I think this one is the best, honestly, in terms of just overall consistency, resiliency, and most importantly, degeneracy, which is something that we haven't really focused on in a lot of the decks that we've constructed. We sort of tend to kind of build decks that are a little bit fair, mainly because fair decks feel generally more fun to play. You get a lot more interactive games that go longer. You're not just kind of pursuing one linear goal the entire time, as a lot of the other degenerate decks in the format are doing. And as a result of that, you get a lot of really cool, closely contested games where you're behind early and you come back, and it makes for great video, it makes for good content. This deck is still capable of doing that. It has lots of long contested games, but it also has lots of bullshit. and to that end, we have called this deck Bullszat. It is including the partnered commanders, and I'm about to reveal them right now. A little surprising given my penchant for blue. The first commander is, there he is, my boy, Tevesh Zet, Doom of Fools. Wow, did I underestimate this Planeswalker when I first encountered it? I actually started running into Tevesh shortly after he was built, and I've seen him paired with a bunch of different commanders. It tends to be generally paired with usually black, blue, and very often black, red. There's a bunch of different partnered choices for that. I haven't really seen him paired with any of the green partnered commanders. Very rarely even with Tymna, as he doesn't have a ton of synergy with Tymna, and black-white as a color combo isn't particularly effective in competitive commander. But my God, is this creature, or I'm calling it a creature, is this Planeswalker completely insane. It is so unbelievably powerful. Comes into play, basically can go to 6 loyalty right away at 5 mana, costs only 1 black mana in the casting cost. All 3 abilities are incredibly powerful and impactful depending on how your deck is built. +2 makes 2 0/1 Thralls, which on the surface doesn't seem all that good, but there are so many ways to leverage those 0/1 Thralls to great effect in the format. You can sacrifice them, you can clamp them, you can equip them, you can use them as blockers, you can use them as all sorts of fodder for different things. They're kind of incredibly versatile, and a steady stream of free creatures presents an obstacle to a lot of decks to really get through. If they're trying to pressure your planeswalkers with creatures, the little tokens can block all day. You can block enormous monsters with them. They buy you crazy amounts of time. And once Tevesh gets up to this ultimate, this -10 ultimate, it is, it's basically often lights out, because if you're able to actually ultimate Tevesh exactly on 10, so, let's say, for example, you +2 him twice and then you +1 him twice and he's at 10, When you -10 him, he goes to the command zone as part of resolution, and I'm sorry, as part of, I guess, paying the -10 loyalty. So he's in the command zone on resolution, which means that he brings himself right back into play as a new card with new memory. So you can just immediately use the ability again. Completely nuts. And of course, you steal all the commanders in the game. Most of the time in competitive EDH, that means you get 1 or 2. But in a multiplayer game, obviously you steal everybody's commander. And good luck having all your opponents come back from that. And in addition, of course, you get to keep your Bullszat, Doom of Fools. But the other main reason, and the reason why he is truly insane and broken beyond belief, is this +1 ability. You may sacrifice another creature or planeswalker. If you do, draw 2 cards, then draw another card if the sacrifice permanent was a commander. And that can include other people's commanders as well. But you wonder, of course, what have we paired Bullszat, Doom of Fools with? Well, here comes the other part of the equation. There's Bullszat right there. Lay him down. Rogra, son of Roga. A 0/1 kobold, totally innocuous, seemingly ineffective, and pretty tiny and insignificant. But the thing is that because of the commander format, the fact that you're playing with partners and this guy is always in your hand, it turns out, unsurprisingly, that a 0-mana 0/1 with some abilities that's always on demand, that's always available in the command zone to enable not just sacrifice outlets and equipment outlets, attacking outlets, attacking triggers, and things like Skull Clamp, and obviously the fuel to fuel the Bullszat, Doom of Fools, is not only incredibly powerful, but incredibly problematic for lots of decks. And keep in mind also, they printed a whole cycle of cards that care about your commander being in play. Foremost among them are cards like, mentioning cards that are in this deck, of course, which we'll get to. But there's a couple of them. I think the one that probably comes to mind the most is Deflecting Swat, a red instant that is basically an actual deflection that you can cast for 0 mana if you control a commander. And if you got Rogra, you generally control your commander. Initially, when I started playing this deck, I was actually not playing Rogra early, right off the bat. But we've since made enough modifications to it that care about Rogra either being in play or actually attacking, that it makes quite a bit of sense to actually deploy him early. And the truth of the matter is that sure, your opponent might actually invest in him and kill him, but he costs 0 and no cards. And if your opponent is spending mana and cards from their hand to destroy something that costs you nothing, literally nothing, to put into play, you're already ahead in the game and likely to just replay him and continue on your merry way. So the pairing of these two guys serves as the backbone engine of this deck. As we progress through the deck, you'll see there's plenty of other engines endemic to it, and but the synergy of these two things is just total madness. You play Rogra early, the deck is incredibly fast and can often employ Bullszat as early as turn 1, very, very frequently on turn 2, and almost deterministically by turn 3 if you don't face any direct opposition or disruption, which means that you can start sacking Rogra, son of Roga, over and over and over again to that +1 ability to draw 3 cards. And +3 hand size isn't just Ancestral Recall. A lot of people call it Ancestral Recall, forgetting the fact that Ancestral Recall costs not only 1 blue mana, but it also costs a card from your hand. So it's actually only +2 hand size. This is a +3 hand size effect for no cost, which is the same as casting Tidings for 0. And there aren't very many competitive decks in any format where you don't just win inevitably after casting Tidings for 0 a few times. Total madness. And particularly in a deck like Red-Black, which is often a little hard up for good, efficient, compact card drawing. That is not the way this deck is. And as most of the decks that Nate and I have constructed over the years, this deck has lots of redundancy layered into it. So talked about the two partnered commanders enough that form the backbone of Bullszat. We're going to move on to the spells. Okay, you guys go over here. Side. All right. Spell number 1. I'm going to start. We're going alphabetically from 0 casting cost up to the highest converted mana cost in the deck. So first card, Chrome Mox. This is a card that I play in some decks, mainly in decks that have a ready way to repair the card advantage. I think people tend to overplay Chrome Mox and they don't really consider what's going to happen if either the Chrome Mox gets destroyed or if they're not able to get their card advantage engine online. And a lot of the time, you keep a hand with 3 or 4 lands in it in a Chrome Mox, and you might actually be imprinting one of the 2 spells in your hand. You can't imprint commanders, obviously, and you need to really make sure that the card belongs in your deck before you throw it in there, because getting fast mana at the cost of a card from your hand in a format that's filled with cheap counter magic and a lot of artifact destruction is kind of dubious principle and doesn't always work out. In this deck, however, totally insane. Anything you can do that's lasting and impactful to ramp out Tevesh quickly is likely to more than pay for itself, and that means that Chrome Mox has an easy place in the deck. Jeweled Lotus. This is the first deck that I built outside of probably Azami and Omnath, which just sort of slotted the card in, where Jeweled Lotus is really, really at its peak performance. And in fact, when Nate was sending me the despondent series of texts on that fateful night back in June, it was Jeweled Lotus that was really at the top of his list, at the top of his hate list, and basically saying this card is just completely bullshit. It's terrible for the format. How the hell are we playing Brea supposed to win against an opponent that has a Black Lotus in their deck? And he was basically right about that. We hadn't really, I don't run this card in Nin for obvious reasons, and I hadn't really run any decks that could properly leverage and abuse the card. But this deck abuses the shit out of this card. If you draw Jeweled Lotus, you're almost always playing Tevesh on turn 1, and if you play Tevesh on turn 1, you're almost always just winning the game on the spot, even if it takes a while to kill him. Jeweled Lotus, I think, is probably at its absolute peak power in this deck. It may be the best Jeweled Lotus deck in the format. There are a few other archetypes where the card really shines. I would say Azami, it's incredible. It's really good in decks like Grand Arbiter, where you have a very powerful and confining commander that you can play early. But Tevesh is on turn 1, starts that crazy card drawing engine right away. And he's so resilient. He's so robust. A minimum of 5 loyalty, often 6 on turn 1. And you can just run away from the game, run away with the game almost immediately. And Jeweled Lotus allows you to do that. It's the kind of card that you would actually mulligan into sometimes. And obviously it's not the most insane top deck, but sometimes you actually have to recast either the Tevesh set, or you're recasting Rogra for maybe 4 mana later on in the game after you've sacked him a few times, and Jeweled Lotus can help you do that. So certainly obligatory inclusion, always wanted in your opening draw. Along the same lines, of course, we have the Mighty Mana Crypt. I've said enough things about this deck, or about this card in previous deck texts. The most powerful card universally in Commander, and obviously the card that you want to mulligan for, the card you want to tutor for more than probably any other card in the format. And yeah, just the best card in EDH. Mox Amber. I haven't actually played too many decks where this card really shines. I think the only deck that I've really been super happy with it up to this point is my Yuriko deck, mainly because it's so easy to get Yuriko into play. My other decks don't really always have the commander in play, and so it's unreliable. This deck has a 0 mana commander, so Mox Amber is an automatic inclusion, and of course you often have Tevesh hanging around as well. So the card's just totally insane. It's just a Mox Ruby in this deck, and I mean, let's look at just thinking back to the other things. There's going to be even more, but I mean, come on, how much is this deck starting to actually resemble a vintage deck? It's got Black Lotus, it has Soul Ring, obviously it has Soul Ring in it, it has Moxes, a bunch of other things. I'm actually going to need to pause for a minute here to deal with that beeping thing. Right back. Forgive the delay. We'll edit that out in post. Anyway, yeah, so Mox Ruby, other Mox type effects, Chrome Mox, Black Lotus. I mean, come on, let's get real. This thing is just starting to resemble an actual vintage deck that just happens to be singleton and a little bit bigger. Love this card. Obviously, it's another card you always want in your opening draw. Along those same lines, we have Mox Diamond. Everybody, of course, respects, admires, covets this card. Beautiful artwork from Stronghold. Reserve list, insanely expensive for good reason. And ever since it was printed in Stronghold, of course, when this card first came out, it was compared to Moxes. It was recent enough relative to the printing of Alpha that people immediately cast aspersions on it, thinking that it was just a terrible version of a Mox. However, of an original Mox. But over time, this card has ascended to the rightful pinnacle that it occupies. One of the best accelerators in the format. Not totally at its absolute best in this deck versus a deck like Brea, where the multicolor, the nature of it, the fact that it provides mana of any color matters as much, but still certainly fantastic ramp. And even in decks that don't run a ton of lands, like most of the decks that we run, it's still consistent enough. You don't really need, I mean, obviously you just get Mox Diamond plus 1 other land and then countless other accelerators. That alone makes the card worth it, and another card you're really, really happy to have in your opening draw. And plus, once you start to go off with lots of card draw, it helps you keep your hand size down as well. Continuing on with the 0 mana artifacts, another Mox. This is Mox Opal, totally amazing in this deck. I think we're running upwards of 20 artifacts total. So Metalcraft, pretty easy to achieve. We also have other ways to get artifacts into play through either treasure production and through tokens from things like Duretti and so on. So Mox Opal, extremely consistent in the deck. Just don't forget that it's legendary in case you have the opportunity to copy it. Another 0 mana thing, Paradise Mantle. This card was kind of off our radar initially when we first built the deck, but over time it increasingly made more and more sense to include it. Anything you can cast for 0 that impacts the game, pretty damn good. And another way to just leverage the early Rogue Ra into mana. I mean, basically you play Paradise Mantle on turn 1 for 0, play Rogue Ra, equip him. You've basically got Bird of Paradise in play on turn 1 in a red-black deck. Totally amazing and well worth the inclusion. All right, that's all the zeros. I believe that's 7 total. I'm going to move on to the 1 colored mana cards. Foremost among them, Culling the Weak. Generally, whenever you see this card in a deck, you can expect broken shenanigans, and this is no exception. Culling the Weak is Dark Ritual for 4 black mana by nature of the fact that you have Rogue Ra in your deck, and you can cast them on for 0 on turn 1. And God, it's just such an insane card to have in the deck when you have this on-demand commander. And obviously later on in the game, you can sacrifice Thrall tokens, you can sacrifice other stuff. But Culling the Weak, totally insane. Another reason to play Rogue Ra on turn 1, because if you have Rogue Ra and your opponent, you have that in play, it introduces an entire range of things that can affect the outcome of the deck because of the mighty Opposition Agent, which has been polluting commander format for several years now. And anybody who plays competitive EDH, anytime they see untapped black mana, is going to be leery of tutoring or using fetches because they're anticipating Opposition Agent. And you can, I've done it a number of times. I'm sure Nate has done it plenty of times. Play Rogue Ra turn 1, your opponent goes turn 1 fetch land, you go Culling the Weak on Rogue Ra, flash out Opposition Agent, and basically just kill them on the spot. I mean, there's no recovering from that pretty much. Stone Ring plus tutor up a land, and you've got a 3/2 in play that prevents them from tutoring up solutions. And totally backbreaking, utterly amazing card to have in your opening hand. And one of the most powerful accelerators in the format, particularly in this deck. Curse of Opulence. I'll admit that this card was actually off my radar a little bit. I think that Nate kind of stumbled upon it after about over a month of testing, and it took me a little while to be convinced of how effective it was. But the more I thought about it, the more powerful the card actually seemed to be. Another really interesting component of Rogue Ra, something that's often forgotten about him, and I'll touch on this later when I talk about some of the other inclusions. He's got 3 abilities on him, and normally don't care about abilities on a creature that's a 0/1, right? First Strike, not too important. Trample, not too important. But Menace actually matters. Menace says the creature cannot be blocked by a single creature. And that means that Rogue Ra, early in the game, can often attack unbridled over and over and over again. Well, Curse of Opulence says whenever enchanted player is attacked, create a gold token. So you can. This is yet another reason to play Rogue Ra turn 1. If you play Rogue Ra turn 1, you play Curse of Opulence turn 2, or even on turn 1, actually. And every time you attack with Rogue Ra, you get a treasure, which means you're accelerating your mana, gives you artifacts for various purposes, and of course gets you even closer to casting Tevesh Zat. And I think that reason alone isn't more than enough reason to run the card. And sometimes you just have it out for a while and you're just accumulating treasure tokens, and it just gives you so much more flexibility. And I think all of that for the cost of just a single red mana in a card is more than worth it. All right, moving on. Dark Ritual. That's a beautiful alpha Dark Ritual. Out of sleeves for you people out there shuddering. Yeah, I couldn't bring myself to put sleeves on this deck. It looks too nice, and these cards just look better on camera when they're not in a white sleeve. Dark Ritual, I don't really need to say much about that, but this has been one of the most powerful cards in any constructed format that it's been legal in since 1993. And of course, automatic card in this deck without any thought. Same goes true for Duress. Arguably, well, probably the second best discard spell ever created behind Thoughtseize. You could make some arguments about Hymn to Torak and Mind Twist, but I'd say that in terms of their impact on broader formats, Duress and Thoughtseize, this sort of dynamic duo of disruption, have been destroying opponents' hopes and dreams since they were introduced. This card dates all the way back to Urza's Saga. And God, I remember having a conversation with my Pro Tour compatriot Chris Pakula when this card was first spoiled, and he said, "I cannot wait to Duress my first Winter Orb." And it's funny, I actually don't think I probably Duress maybe a few Winter Orbs in my day, but certainly the ability to go first and Duress away opponents' turn 1 Crypt and Sol Ring is one of the primary reasons why you play the card. It also softens up your opponent's hand to pave the way for the Tevesh Zat and so on, or to just look and see what's going on. Universally amazing. I would absolutely play more than one Duress if I could. Oops, a little spoiler there. All right, Expedition Map. And I'm sure that people who have seen other videos that I've done have probably recognized that this card is a little bit of a pet card of mine and of Nate's. But holy shit, I mean, this card has gotten better and better and better as time has gone by. Initially, just the ability to fetch Wasteland or Strip Mine when you need them to set up Crucible Lock, extremely powerful. Gets Ancient Tomb, gets Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth if you need extra black. It's great in 4-color decks because you can go get specific fetch lands, and you can get the perfect fetch land to feed your Crucible of Worlds. It gets Mishra's Workshop. But a little while back, they printed another land called Urza's Saga, which I'll get to later. And I would say that Expedition Map probably gets Urza's Saga at least half the time. Urza's Saga, arguably the most powerful land that's ever been introduced, at least for the Commander format, and particularly for the decks that we play. There's certainly some decks where it doesn't shine that much. But in this deck, it is absolutely titanically insane in power level, completely ridiculous. I've actually had games where I've gone turn 1 Expedition Map, turn 2 sack it, go get an Urza Saga, play it, and that is literally the only thing I did the entire game other than just make a couple of constructs and cast artifacts and just beat their face in until they were dead. And meanwhile, the guy sitting on his mono blue deck with all of his counter magic is just watching this unfold. And obviously, he can't counter every single random innocuous artifact I play. He's waiting for me to play my commander, and meanwhile, I'm hitting him for 10 a turn with 2 5/5s. And not only do you get that, but you even fetches Soul Ring at the end, or Skull Clamp, or any other things you might need. We're actually considering adding Pithing Needle to the deck, which I think it may find a place in here eventually, and Expedition Map is a route to Pithing Needle if you really need it. The flexibility is incredible. It only costs 1. It's a land tutor. I think this card is incredibly underplayed, and I really, really strongly recommend you try it in multiple deck lists out there, not just in this one, but in general. I think you'll find that it's one of the best cards you can actually have early. Imperial Seal, white bordered one that I got ages ago. This card has been reprinted a bunch of times, but of course, I don't really need to talk too much about the effect. Sure, it's sorcery speed, but the flexibility, 2 life to get any card on top of your library. And almost, I would say a good half the time, this card is fetching Mana Crypt. Mana Crypt or Soul Ring, depending on the situation. Obviously, it can fetch Silver Bullets, can fetch Necro, plenty of other outs and stuff that it can get you. One of the best black cards in the format, for sure. Inquisition of Kozilek. So this card I play in Zur as well, kind of in an indie deck where early game disruption is your primary goal. Inquisition, same thing as Duress in terms of its ability to hit both Crypt and Soul Ring early and disrupt the opponent's game. And that 3 mana range, a little bit, for people who play multiplayer Commander and stuff, they may think that Inquisition is a little on the weak side, but competitive Commander games are really defined by the 1 to 3 mana range usually. Most of the important, impactful stuff that affects the outcome of the game happens there. You win the game with the stuff that costs more, but most of the important things that enables and abets all of the high-end stuff comes in the 1 to 3 mana range, and Inquisition handles all those things. It takes out most of the good counter spells, allows you to navigate your way around cards like Mana Drain and stuff, and some of the free counters, and overall, it's just another awesome card to have early to get information as well. Beta Mana Vault, beautiful card right here. One of the best accelerators that's legal in the format, one of the many very problematic fast artifacts, and of course, totally insane in this deck, giving you the ability to ramp into Tavish Zat on turn 2. Mana Vault is reasons for instant snap keeps. All right, look at this guy. This is the first Commander deck that I've actually played Ragavan Nimble Pilfer in, and I mean, the way that I've described this creature is this guy is power creep incarnate. I mean, if you imagine if you were to take somebody from 1996 when the Tempest set debuted. I believe maybe Tempest came out in 1997. And I was playing competitive Pro Magic in 1997. This is back when, right before Dave Price won the, I think it was the 2nd or the 3rd Pro Tour on the Queen Mary in Long Beach. And the collective Magic world lost their minds when they printed Jackal Pup. And they looked at Jackal Pup and they said, what the hell is Wizards thinking? They're printing 2/1 red creatures for 1 mana. We have a red Savannah line. What's going on with the game? You're ruining the game. You're making things that are way too powerful. Imagine showing Ragavan to those guys. So not only do you get Jackal Pup with no drawback, you also get Jackal Pup that produces mana and generates card advantage and has dash also, so that you can dash it in around a lot of their removal range to kill planeswalkers and stuff. Ragavan, completely, utterly insane. Unfortunately, you're allowed to play this guy as a commander, too, and there are Ragavan decks that are absolutely top tier in competitive EDH. But you don't get him every single game, obviously, because he's just in the deck rather than a commander. But if you draw Ragavan early, the amount of spot removal, people play very, very little spot removal, and you have quite a bit of removal yourself. And if he connects just one time, it's often decisive. If he connects a couple times, you've probably just won the game. And that is just totally absurd value for a 1-drop. And later on in the game, if you draw him and he's not really impactful, obviously you can't get through or whatever, you can just sack him to Rogue Ra, you can clamp him. There's many other ways to leverage him as well. Totally insane creature. And really, again, a sign of really where the design aesthetics of Magic have gone in the last couple of years. Shattering Spree, an awesome replicate card. And one thing that we really noticed when building this particular deck, this is the first deck that we've played in a really long time at a competitive level that doesn't have counter spells outside of Deflecting Swat. And that's a super narrow counter anyway. And one thing that's an overriding concern, of course, most of the decks that I play are containment-based decks. And the chief way that you do containment, at least in most of my designs, is through a combination of mana denial, mana destruction, and counter magic, with usually a secondary component of discard. This deck is obviously much more focused on discard, and because you don't have counter spells, the containment plan really, really has to be artifact-centric, which means that you do play with a range of artifact destruction you wouldn't normally employ in other decks like the Nin the Pain Artist deck, for example, which I do run a reasonable amount of artifact kill, but nowhere near as many as in this deck. And one of the most important components of artifact kill, as you'll see later with some of the other card choices, is the interactivity on turn 1. If your opponent leads with Soul Ring or Crypt, and they often will do that because you're playing, if they understand that you're playing black, they want to get the Mana Crypt into play and keep it safe from the 3 1 black mana discard spells. And you really, really need to have turn 1 interaction. Shattering Spree, 1 red mana, sorcery, kill an artifact. Sometimes you're replicating it 2, 3, 4 times and just destroying their entire board. It'll often be even more powerful than Vandal Blast in terms of mana efficiency. And, paying 3 mana to kill 3 artifacts versus 5 from a Vandal Blast or something. It is targeted, but that's not really too big of a deal. I've gotten tremendous respect for this card, and I actually think that I'll likely be playing it in other any red-based commander decks going forward, and probably have to reevaluate it in Nin the Pain Artist deck as well. Although at least in that deck, I don't tend to run a ton of red sources. This deck has way more red sources, so that makes the card much better. But I've been incredibly pleased with it. I've tutored for it many times, and I'm sure you will also. All right. Keeping with the Bullszat theme, we've got Skull Clamp here, one of the most powerful and insane cards ever printed. I've talked anecdotally about this card before, and a lot of people have looked at Skull Clamp and shaken their heads and wondered how the hell could this card get through playtesting. And the truth of the matter, for people who haven't heard this story before, is that Skull Clamp actually did make it through the development playtest gauntlet in a totally different form. Well, not entirely different, but this ability down here, equip creature gets +1, -1. It used to just be +1, +0. The other ability was the same, the cost and equip were the same. And there was apparently some nervousness that the card was too good. And so that little bit right here, this -1 component, was added to the card after it had made its way through development, right before it was printed, in an effort to make it more balanced and more fair. It's like, did the guys that made that decision, had they ever actually played a game of Magic in their lives? Did they realize that there are actually lots of creatures that have 1 toughness, including tokens, including 0/1 Thralls from Tevish Zat? Well, you get the idea. I'd say Skull Clamp is right at the very, very pinnacle of power level in the deck. And it's very, very hard to lose a game where you get Skull Clamp early or even mid-game. Keep in mind also, there's a very, very important mechanical change that was made to Commanders recently. I assume that it's for live play. It certainly exists online. But until quite recently, actually, if Commanders died, they never actually touched the graveyard, and therefore they wouldn't trigger goes to the graveyard triggered abilities. But that changed recently, which means that you can play Rogue Ra and clamp him and draw 2 cards and then put Rogue Ra back in the command zone. Previously, you just clamp him and nothing would happen. You'd feel like a moron. But now you can actually get 2 cards out of him, and you can do that repeatedly in a pinch. And some games, that's really what you're doing early. You just play Rogue Ra and clamp him a few times, and you get so far ahead, your opponent can't keep up. Obviously, by mid-game, you've got the ability to pay 2 mana plus Tevish Zat's +2 activated ability to draw 4 extra cards a turn, and for the cost of 2, and that is overwhelmingly powerful and will result in you winning the game very quickly. Skull Clamp is totally insane, and I was talking before about how powerful Urza's Saga is. I would say that Skull Clamp is one of my chief targets with Saga. Obviously, if you play Saga early, you're often just getting a Soul Ring with it. by the third turn. But by mid-game, Skull Clamp is almost always the correct target, and a very frequent tutor target as well, and a way to just lock up the game. Got an Alpha Soul Ring. Anybody who's played Commander here has played with this card and faced it enough times to know how just unfair and insane it is. And you got to go with the best picture ever possible. This gorgeous thing. All right, another ubiquitous 1-mana artifact, Springleaf Drum. And if your degenerate deck is playing Springleaf Drum, you know that things have certainly gone awry in your favor. This is yet another way to leverage the early Rogue Ra and effectively have a Bird of Paradise. And the big difference, of course, between this and the Paradise Mantle is that you can play Springleaf Drum and immediately use it. So it replaces itself on turn one. So if you get your opening hand and you have Springleaf Drum in it, realize that it's basically effectively costs 0 off the commander. And it taps for 1 mana of any color also, which is just awesome and is not affected by Summoning Sickness. You can use this off the Thralls too. Just extremely versatile. I've been very, very happy with the card every time that I've drawn it, and certainly seems like an auto-include for the deck. All right, we got Thoughtseize. I was talking about the best disruption discard spells in Magic, and I would say that probably, certainly in formats where you have 4 to left, Thoughtseize is just number 1, because it's duress, but with no drawback. And the only difference, of course, is that duress actually says target opponent, and Thoughtseize says target player. So you can Thoughtseize yourself, of course, and some decks like Reanimator do that from time to time. But the reason why that really matters is in terms of the card deflecting swat. If your opponent swats a Thoughtseize, they can make you discard, but your opponent cannot swat a duress, as it's targeting them and it says target opponent. They can't redirect it onto you, to the best of my knowledge. Hopefully I'm not wrong about that. Anyway, Thoughtseize, so good to get early. Just surgical discard, one of the most powerful effects you can have. It's obviously even better than random discard, and also gives you all the reconnaissance you need to be able to figure out exactly how to navigate around your opponent's hand, because you have to do that when you don't have counter magic yourself. Very, very high skill card as well. I just love it. All right, Vampiric Tutor, just better version of Imperial Seal, and obligatory inclusion in basically any deck with black in the format. Vandal Blast. All right, another 1 red mana interact with artifacts card. And I was talking before about how I compare this card to Shattering Spree. I think probably overall Vandal Blast is a better card, given the fact that it scales, it doesn't target. Obviously for multiplayer, it's completely insane. It has the same basic utility, but the difference between having to cast 1 and 5 is a big deal. And a lot of the time, one sort of source of discomfort with Vandal Blast is when your opponent gets a draw like turn 1 land Soul Ring Signet or something like that. And obviously in that situation, you're just going to Vandal Blast the Soul Ring and move on. You're not going to be able to be patient enough to kill off 2 artifacts. But with Shattering Spree, depending on whether or not you went first or second and your mana at the time, you can kill both artifacts for just 2 mana, or it might actually be worth it to wait a turn. Potentially, it depends on what your opponent's likely to do. Vandal Blast, you don't have that option. You have to either just play it all or nothing. And as a result of that, I would say that the card is, at least in this deck, is probably a little bit worse than Shattering Spree on average. In multiplayer, it's a different story entirely, and obviously Vandal Blast is at peak power, as are all the Overload cards. But I'd say that Spree is just a little bit ahead of Vandal Blast. Of course, you play them both. All right, that's all the 1-drops. I think that's 16 1-mana spells. I haven't looked at the list exactly in that way, but I'm going to move to 2. Keeping with the artifact theme, one of my very, very favorite modal cards made in the last couple of years is Abrade, and this has made it into my Nin the Pain Artist deck as well. It's also made it into Brea. It was in the Kess deck. Just phenomenal spell. Instant speed, deal 3 to creature, which catches most of the early commanders, particularly the really pesky ones like Timna and Thrasios, and of course it's just artifact kill. And those 2 modes and the flexibility make the card just an auto-include in any type of containment-based red deck. I run this card in Canadian Highlander as well. It's just a phenomenal effect, and definitely one of my favorite red cards from recent memory. Engrath's Rampage. This is a card that when I built my first prototype of Bullszat, I missed it entirely, actually. And then Nate spent a lot of time just sort of poring over the spoilers while he was testing and looking for things to answer specific threat ranges, and Engrath's Rampage does that so well. Don't forget, however, that it is a sorcery speed card. I made the mistake initially of thinking the card was instant. I tried to play it. I don't remember the situation, but I felt very foolish when I couldn't cast it. It is sorcery speed, but man, is this card amazing. One of the biggest weaknesses in red-black is the inability to interact directly with planeswalkers. There's just sort of a type of permanent that red-black nearly creatureless struggles to deal with. And Engrass Rampage, target players sacrifices a planeswalker. You just target them with it. You can get them to sacrifice their 5 or 6 mana planeswalker. It shatters artifacts just fine, just like a Braid does, although not at instant speed. And it makes your opponent sacrifice creatures. So if they play their turn 3 Tymna or something, you can kill that as well. That's just amazing flexibility and value for 2 mana. Clearly one of the best red-black spells printed in Commander, and has a natural place in this deck. Arcane Signet, just universal, include in every single deck. Since it was printed, there probably aren't really any decks in Commander, and certainly not in CDH, that shouldn't run Arcane Signet. It's just not included in everything. You all know how good it is. All right, Collective Brutality. I think among all the spells in this deck, this card has come on and off the list more than any other one. I think I had it initially, and then it got cut, and then it got added back again, and then it got cut again, and then it found its way back into the list again. And I think that it's probably here to stay. I think that the modes are consistent enough. Primarily the discard instant or sorcery effect is enough of the reason to run the card. It also, of course, kills some of the very problematic commanders. Foremost among them is Tymna. And being able to kill Tymna and make them discard by escalating and discarding a land or maybe a redundant mana artifact is a very, very powerful effect. And that is generally enough. I mean, every now and then, one of the big weaknesses of this deck, if it really does have a weakness, and something that we've tried to address a few times, is the lack of life gain. And we've brainstormed for different sources of life gain. At any given time, there's been anywhere from 0 to 2 different versions of devoted life gain in the deck. Actually, I guess 3 different ones we've tried. Sorin, the Mirthless, Batterskull, and Umezawa's Jitte have all been in the deck at one point or another. And none of them has been consistent enough to really warrant inclusion. You don't really need life gain that many times. And you're very, very rarely losing specifically because you don't have the ability to gain life. There's a lot of games that are uncomfortable because you're low on life, but you very, very seldom actually lose specifically because you're out of life and you would have won otherwise. And because of those reasons, dedicated life gain hasn't really found a permanent place in the deck, although that may change in time still. It's still kind of a flexible thing. And this deck can gain you 2 life in a pinch. You have multiple ways to recur it, so you could actually potentially cast it more than once. But very rarely are you escalating to gain 2 life and deal 2, unless things have gone horribly wrong. But the -2 ability is really powerful, and obviously the ability to surgically take your opponent's hand apart and play to pave the way for your commander is really important. And that's why the card is in the deck. I would say that as far as cards that are kind of on the bubble of inclusion, this card is definitely near the lower end of that spectrum. This guy, however, is not near the lower end of any spectrum. Dark Confidant, totally insane. I haven't done the actual math on this converted CMC of the deck, but I estimate that it's probably somewhere between 2 and 3. It might even, actually, it's got to be lower than that. I actually estimate that it's probably like about 1.6 to 1.7 CMC per card in the deck. Probably not per spell. But if you remember back, we had 7 0-mana things, 16 things that cost 1, a similar number of things that cost 2, and then all the lands. Very, very low curve deck, and that's sort of how we tend to build our competitive commander decks anyway. And Dark Confidant, totally insane. It just pressures so many problematic decks. There just aren't that many decks that run a ton of spot removal. And you can often play Dark Confidant on turn 1 with all the Moxes and stuff. You play Dark Confidant on turn 1 and they don't kill it, you pretty much just win on the spot as well. And that's greatness at very low cost. Love this guy. Keep in mind also, as you'll see later, we have numerous ways to utilize the fact that he's a creature. Demonic Tutor, beautiful beta one. No reason to really talk about this card at length, since it's just ubiquitous, universally played. Diabolic Intent. It's Dark Demonic Tutor's little cousin, which I haven't really found a place for this card in most decks outside of the Yuriko deck, which I was very, very happy with it in Yuriko, but that's of course because you can just cast Yuriko for free over and over again. You also have a bunch of other creatures to sack. And this deck has a 0-mana commander as well as free thralls and stuff. So Diabolic Intent, almost perfectly interchangeable with Demonic Tutor. And you just get to play with 2 Demonic Tutors in addition to a million Moxes and Black Lotus and everything else. You can see why we call this deck Bullset. It's just bullshit. So many powerful, insane effects. And really kind of making a mockery of what Commander is really supposed to be about. Dreadbore. This is actually a card that I was advocating for a long time. Nate was not convinced, and summarily we actually had it cut out of the list. We tried a couple of other things in this slot, mainly to have more Planeswalker interactivity. We had Murderous Rider in an early version of the deck, also had Bedevil, which I tried out a bit. And Bedevil costs 3, it's instant speed, it has that extra flexibility of killing artifacts, but paying 3 mana to kill an artifact is not a very good deal. You kind of need to really focus on where are the biggest weaknesses. And while killing a creature or a Planeswalker for 3 feels generally okay, it feels fine, particularly the Planeswalker, paying 3 mana to kill an artifact that's already pumped out 2 or 3 other horrible threats feels really, really terrible. And in fact, you often don't have the ability to do that because you're bedeviling the thing that those artifacts enabled or produced. And I think that's justification to not run Bedevil, even though it's instant speed, because the difference between paying 50% more mana for the same effect most of the time is just not worth it. Dreadbore's just so flexible. It's basically just terminate, plus you just happen to be able to splash on and kill Planeswalkers too. And that can be incredibly important when your opponent plays something like a turn 3 Narset against you, or they're playing a mirror match and they ritual out their Tavish Zat on turn 2 or something. And having Dreadbore in hand, ready to go, or somewhere in your deck where you can just tutor for it and immediately just deal with the threat and make it cost 7 is pretty decisive. And I think the flexibility of that alone, this is a new inclusion. I would say that it's still, with the caveat that it's still under consideration, but it's likely to find a permanent place in the deck. I really like it. I tend to be a more conservative player in general, and having these kind of answers in my deck is pretty important to me. Embereth Shieldbreaker. Another cool adventure card that's made its way into the deck after a little while. This guy was basically included at Nate's insistence because he was just over and over and over again just struggling to deal with artifacts on turn 1. We have a few ways to deal with them. We're not running Pithing Needle. We do have, of course, the Shattering Spree, and we have Vandal Blast, but sometimes, frequently, they just have a turn 1 artifact, and if you can't kill it right away, the game's going to be exponentially harder. So Embereth Shieldbreaker, good enough just for the single red mana sorcery speed artifact kill, but as the deck has progressed and changed over time, and we've added more effects to it, things like Curse of Opulence and so on, having creatures in play actually is relevant and matters. And so the 2/1 body has become increasingly useful as well, and I think that means that Embereth Shieldbreaker will likely be in here in perpetuity. All right. Feed the Swarm. Man, what an amazing card. I started playing with this card a bunch in Kess. Was incredibly impressed by it. I think that this card is a 100% auto-include in the format in any deck with access to black. That flexibility is so good, and there's more than enough really powerful, cheap enchantments that you need to be able to destroy. Cards like Land Tax, obviously Sylvan Library, the biggest defender, but there's tons of other ones that you're just sitting there going, my God, I really wish I had a way to kill an enchantment. And of course, as black-red, your opportunities to kill enchantments are extremely limited. This card is way outside the color pie in terms of its effect, and I hope it's a sign of things to come. I would like to see more cards in black or in red that allow you to sacrifice life to kill enchantments, since lots of other colors have gotten ways to interact with permanent types or even spells that seem a little bit unfair and in violation of the rules of the color pie. So Feed the Swarm, fantastic card. You will seldom be unhappy to have it in your hand. Grim Monolith, just in the same vein as Mana Vault, a little bit underpowered, minus the damage, has gone up crazily in price recently as well. I can't believe how expensive this card has gotten. It took a long time for people to really figure out just how good it was. Although if you were playing Magic back in 1999 during the Saga block, you could build entire decks. There was a deck called, what was it called? Something blue. It was like a crazy blue deck that I remember playing it in, I think it was like California Regionals or something. And it used Time Spiral, Grim Monolith, and Palancron, and a bunch of just super, super fast stuff. And Grim Monolith was totally the backbone of the deck, and it gave me a real appreciation for the card. And we pretty much run it in almost all commander lists. I don't run it in every single one. There's a few hyper-specialized commander decks where it's not great, but most of the time this card should be an auto-include in just about any commander list. And of course, it's fantastic in here since it enables you to play Tavish Zat much faster. Hymned Torak. Anytime you're playing any black component in your deck, you should be running Hymn to Torak. It doesn't matter whether or not you play exclusively multiplayer or whether or not you play 1v1. And 1v1, Hymn to Torak, absolutely backbreaking. Honestly, competitive with Mind Twist in many respects because it's 2 mana to do 2 random discard versus 3 for Mind Twist. and allows you to just steal games you had no business winning, where you just take out the 2 perfect cards from your opponent's hand and just leave them high and dry and helpless to stop you. Don't need to say much else about this other than that, yeah, it's just nasty. Look at that wolf picture. Liquid Metal Torque. Wow, I cannot express to you how much I love this card. When it was first printed, Nate and I looked at it and went, man, what the hell? Like, look at that second ability, right? It just makes a generic mana, that's fine. But target non-land permanent becomes an artifact in addition to its other types until end of turn. Well, if there's one thing that red is pretty damn good at doing, it's killing artifacts. And Liquid Metal Torque gives you crazy interaction with all sorts of permanent types you wouldn't ordinarily be able to touch. So for example, you can turn enchantments or planeswalkers into artifacts and destroy them indiscriminately with all the countless artifact kill spells in the deck. If you have something repeatable like Duretti in play, you can use Duretti's ability to kill anything in play. And yeah, the abilities of Liquid Metal Torque to just do all sorts of cool shenanigans, practically limitless. We're not running Dak Faden in the deck, obviously, because we have no access to blue, but that's one of the coolest interactions that exists. You use Dak Faden to steal things like a Jace the Mind Sculptor or something. But just the uses for Liquid Metal Torque go on and on and on. I can't tell you how many times I've done something that was just surprising and unexpected that was extremely decisive as well. And that is, to me, that's just peak amazing design. And it's so simple and elegant, and it's an accelerator. I mean, I can't say enough good things about this card. If you haven't played with Liquid Metal Torque, just throw it in a deck and try it out, and you will just see over and over and over again, wow, I can't believe how good this is for just 2 mana. All right, Priest of Forgotten Gods. So this is another card that I absolutely have Nate's ingenuity to thank. Would have been completely off my radar, but this was sort of, I think, the consequence of a late night brainstorming session by him after putting in 50 more reps or whatever and playing a ton of games and really, really wishing he had more instant speed interaction. And I was really reluctant to play with Priest of the Forgotten Gods. I basically said, well, the card seems like it's okay, but it seems very win more to me. And one of my kind of mantras as a competitive spike-based commander player is don't put cards in your deck that are exclusively win more, that allow you to, that are really only effective when you're totally far ahead in the game. But the problem is that because that maxim is generally true for blue-based decks, and when you get ahead by quite a bit in a blue-based deck like Nin, you do have that inevitability. You've got a bunch of counter spells, and anything that just makes you win more is redundant and isn't going to help, particularly if it sucks when you're behind. But this is a black-red deck, which doesn't have counters. And you really actually, and you're pretty grindy as well. You're not doomsdaying into some game-ending combo or something. Spoiler about what's coming in the 3 slot. I don't have Doomsday. But you're often in these positions where you're really, really in command of the game, but your opponent can kind of get back into it because they can play some sort of big, robust creature or big commander and something, and yet now you're kind of struggling to find answers to it again. And Priest of the Forgotten Gods, once Tevesh Zad is up and running, really lends an aura of inevitability and hopelessness to your opponent's game plan. You have her just sitting, I think it's a girl, yeah. You have her sitting in place untapped, and you've got 3 or 4 thralls just hanging out doing their thrall thing, and your opponent can't play any creatures anymore for the rest of the game until they deal with Priest of the Forgotten Gods, making it basically like an abyss that makes mana and draws cards, and that costs 2 mana. Pretty insane. Anything that can convert those the Tevesh Zat thralls into an abyss effect that's also card advantage and mana generation, like Soul Ring, is pretty damn good. And having played with Priest of Forgotten Gods a bunch of times, almost every time I play it, my opponents read it, and then they proceed to lose to it. And I think that that's a pretty good sign of a card that belongs in the deck. I'm very, very happy with it. I would say that if you're really, really hard up to add some pet card of yours, or there's something you really, really want, then maybe you could consider cutting Priest of the Forgotten Gods. I certainly don't think it's a mandatory inclusion, but I've been very, very happy with the card in general, and I believe I'll continue to feel that way. All right, we've got Rakdos Signet, of course, obligatory inclusion in any type of slower or control-based black-red strategy. In the same vein, Talisman of Indulgence. And that takes us to Tome of Legends. I was actually just having a conversation with Nate about this card earlier, and he was saying, man, I want to include, the card we were actually discussing is the 6-mana Ugin. The second part of its name eludes me right now, but it's the one that makes your creature spells cost 2 less, and you can plus him to manifest the top card of your library, I think. And then you can also -3 him to destroy a permanent with any colors in its casting cost. And Nate was saying, well, maybe we should cut Tome of Legends. In my experience, You do not want to do that. This card is insane. It is so powerful. It just blew my mind. As soon as I started playing with it and saw its synergies with Rogue Raw. Now remember, getting back to old Little Goblin, right? He's got Menace. He's got Menace. They often do not have two creatures in play, or any creatures for that matter. You can attack with this guy even though he's a 0/1. I know that for people who play Hearthstone or Eternal and stuff, you can't attack with creatures that don't have power. But Magic is different. You can attack with any creature even if it has 0 power or negative power. And that means you can just indiscriminately throw tokens onto the Tome of Legends. So you play it on turn 2, you summon Rogue Raw, that immediately bumps it up to 2. It's so cheap to activate. 1 mana to draw a card. Totally insane effect. And if you're able to attack repeatedly with Rogue Raw, as you usually can, that means you're just getting 2 cards a turn for practically no cost. And the fact that the CMC is just 2 allows you to deploy this card against blue decks often before they have the ability to interact with you or counterspell. And if they can't kill a Tome of Legends that's running, they're not going to win the game. There's just no way to get around the double draw every turn for practically no cost. And it gives you so much flexibility and the ability to just play all the other stuff and just ramp further and further ahead. The card feels honestly very much akin to a card like Library of Alexandria, how that card would feel. I mean, Library doesn't cost any mana to draw a card, but it does deny you a mana that it would make, so it's effectively the same. This costs 1 to tap and draw. Library costs itself to tap and draw. And it has obviously the extra constraint of needing 7 cards in hand, and this does not have that. So I would say that this card is actually one of the closest cards that I've ever played with in Commander format that feels like Library of Alexandria, and it has that sort of same impact on the game. Crazy inevitability forces your opponent to scramble and panic trying to deal with it, or invest cards in killing off a 0/1 free Kobold, which is going to put you ahead anyway. I've really been impressed with Tome of Legends, and I think if you play it, you will feel the same way. That brings us to, I believe, the last 2-mana spell. There he is, the beautiful bear. And I'll admit that actually we did not include this card for a while. There was quite a period of time, I'd say over a month of playtesting when Winter Orb actually wasn't in the deck. And that was primarily because we didn't really have a lot of ways to leverage a situation where we could take advantage of it. We didn't have any way to cheat the mana on it, so we kind of had to suffer the effects other than just hoping to have more artifacts in play than the opponent, which is a decent game plan, although not a great one. And most of the time when Winter Orb is truly at its best, it's because you have ways to circumvent the drawback, either generally by tapping the Winter Orb through something like Urza's effect, or through untapping your lands through something like Sword of Feast and Famine. We obviously didn't have Urza by nature of not having any blue, and we didn't have Sword of Feast and Famine in the deck either, and that meant that Winter Orb probably wasn't quite good enough. But Nate was really struggling with decks that he was dominating them early, and then you'd kind of get to the mid-game, and the opponent would just tutor and draw their way out of the situation, and eventually just combo off and go off and win. And Winter Orb was added to address that specific fringe case, which actually isn't so fringe. And having played with it, I would say that Winter Orb does not feel like an automatic inclusion in this deck the way that it does in a deck like Brea. But I think that you kind of need access to the tool, and there's a lot of games where your opponent's just tapped out on like turn 4, turn 5, and you can play Winter Orb, and if not win the game outright on the spot, you can really cripple their ability to stay in the game and set them really far back. And it just gives you answers to out-of-control runaway board states where your opponent has ramped out a shitload of mana and stuff, and they tap out for that one big thing. You deal with it, you untap, you Vandal Blast them and play Winter Orb, and suddenly you're back in a game that you were just hopelessly behind before because they've got, a full hand of cards and 12 land in play. And Winter Orb is kind of the only thing that can really do that, at least in a compact way. And I think that alone makes the card worth it. Plus, I mean, come on, it just looks awesome. All right, we've moved on to the 3s. So, brand new card, actually, and a card, unfortunately, that has not made its way to Magic Online yet. Black Market Connections. I believe this card was printed in some kind of promotional product, which would explain why it's not in Magic Online yet. It'll inevitably make its way there. You can actually already, you can kind of quasi-add it to a Magic Online deck. You can actually add the card with quantity 0, so it shows that you have it, but it's sort of grayed out, so you don't actually have the ability to play with it. But I'm certain that it'll be online soon enough. And I'll admit to having not played with this card enough live. In fact, I don't even think I've actually done anything but just take test draws with Tevesh Zat live, because I haven't really been playing any live Magic for quite a while. We have that whole global pandemic thing still going on. And And unfortunately, since we can't play with it online, at least not on Magic Online, that means we haven't really been able to put it through the paces. But drawing on our very, very ample knowledge base of having logged collectively many tens of thousands of hours of Magic play, I can pretty rest assured say that I think that this card is bonkers. If you look at it right now, for people who aren't familiar with it, at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, that's also very important. It triggers on the turn, you get to trigger it on the turn that you play it, provided that you don't attack first. You choose one or more, sell contraband, create a treasure token, you lose 1 life. So you can just immediately get a rebate. The card costs 3, but it actually only effectively costs 2. And treasure tokens, of course, allow you to move mana between turns, which is incredibly powerful. If you harken back to decks like Omnath and stuff, you just sort of break fundamental rules of the game. Buy information, draw a card, you lose 2 life. Now, the value of an individual card in Commander, I would say, is somewhere around the neighborhood of 4 life. If you think about how powerful Sylvan Library is and how you'll very readily take 8 damage a turn for a while, this gives you a card for just 2 life. So that's incredible, and obviously it just is better than Sylvan in many respects. Hire a mercenary, create a 3/2 colorless shapeshifter token with changeling. Very interesting. It's all creature types. You lose 3 life. So I'd say of the abilities, this is the least likely one you're likely to do. But the flexibility is insane. Being able to get 3/2 creatures every turn for 0 cost while making mana and drawing extra cards. I mean, sure, you lose 5-6 life a turn, but you'll be all right, I think, probably. And 3/2 creatures give you the ability to pressure opponents' planeswalkers and protect your own from being attacked. I know those 2 things means that it's probably something you're going to want to do at least a little bit, particularly if you're playing against a deck where they're not threatening your life total and you can pay indiscriminate life. We obviously have a lot of ways in the deck to leverage life to great effect, and so you can't be totally reckless with your life total and just make a whole bunch of 3/2s because it seems like fun and find yourself at 12 or something and unable to use some of the other best effects that use life in the deck. But overall, even if you're just selling contraband and buying information every turn, that's make a mana, draw a card on the turn even that you play Black Market Connections. And I can't imagine losing a game where this card is in play and runs for just a couple of turns. It's just going to put you so far ahead that your opponent is going to be scrambling to really find a foothold in the game. And then you can sort of scale it back. Once you've got another card advantage engine online, you can probably stop paying 2 to draw a card every turn, although you probably still keep doing it. You'll just be selling contraband and maybe making a guy here and there and whatever. But really, really cool to see this card played out. I love to hear people's anecdotal experiences, people who have actually had some experience in 1v1 or in group games playing with it. But I suspect it will be at least as good as our expectations, if not better. Coalition Relic. All right. Usually be dubious or reluctant to play with a 3-mana accelerator. Basalt Monolith is another card I've seen in some of these Tevesh Zat decks, but we don't have any way to really abuse it. We're not running Rings of Bright Hearth. We're not running Power Artifact, obviously. And as a result of that, I think that the Basalt Monolith probably doesn't belong in the deck. Coalition Relic allows you to hit double colors really easily, double black or double red. We're not running a ton of double reds, but we do have a few. And we're running Mishra's Workshop, obviously. And Workshop into Coalition Relic is one of the most powerful plays you can make at the start of the game. Additionally, the Workshop with Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth also much better too, because you can turn it into a black source and ramp out your Tevesh set quickly. But I think that Coalition Relic isn't like 100% guaranteed to be in the deck. We've had some discussions about possibly cutting it, but I think it's just right on the bubble and just powerful enough to warrant inclusion. It's a little slow, but it's seldom a card that you feel bad about having in your opening hand, which is usually a sign of something that should be in the deck, and I think it should probably remain there. Crucible of Worlds. We are running, I believe, a total of, I think it's 6 fetch lands, alongside Wasteland, Strip Mine, and Urza's Saga. Obviously, we have the 4 black fetching fetch lands, and I think that we have Wooded Foothills and Arid Mesa as well. I don't think that we're running the entire suite of red-based fetches, if I think about that. Obviously, we have Scalding Tarn and the black-red one. I guess maybe that is all 4. Yeah, I guess maybe we do have all 4. More than enough targets, though. Crucible of Worlds, super amazing. There's lots of land destruction in the format. We also have Expedition Map to make it even better. And this is a long attrition-based grindy deck, and being able to recur your lands, incredibly powerful, and will often keep you in games that you would otherwise lose because you're able to hold parity against your opponent's Crucible Strip Block or something like that. And it's often your only way, to hold on to the game that you would otherwise be doomed in. Get ready. Ingenious Iconoclast, one of my very, very favorite hybrid cards ever made. I guess it's gold, not technically hybrid, but a super powerhouse all-star in Brea and no less weak in this deck. And it's gotten even better with all of the treasure-generating cards that we've introduced since the original prototypes were built. It was very, very good then and certainly was 100% worth using, and it's only gotten better over time. The ability to make those 1/1 defenders to block with, it enables Metalcraft. We have Skull Clamp to clamp the tokens. It's removal of both artifacts and creatures, just insane flexibility. And the ultimate is nothing to sneeze at as well, although you seldom do it, but it does have the potential to go off in the late game. Ready, so much power for just 3 mana. Can't really say enough good things about this guy that I haven't already said in other videos. Deflecting Swat. Man, I gotta say, I really actually discounted this card when it was first printed, and we didn't run it in Brea for ages. I think mainly because Brea, is a 4-mana commander. It's harder to get him into play. I don't recall, I haven't looked at my Nin list in a while, but if I don't have this in my Nin deck, I certainly should have it in my Nin deck. The card is just nuts, and having played it tons now in Bullszat, I've really, really grown to not only love, but really respect this card. It gives you interaction you would never ever imagine, allows you to push things through counter magic, and occasionally just creates blowout situations when your opponent invests multiple cards in trying to kill your stuff. Nothing beats the turn 1 deflecting Swat, a strip mine back onto your opponent's lands and stuff. I mean, the card's just bonkers, and it gives black-red interactivity that frankly it shouldn't have. And costs nothing because you have Rogra in play, and he costs 0 also. So totally insane and degenerate. One of the best and most powerful format-defining spells that's been printed in ages. And speaking of a non-format defining spell that was printed a million years ago, all the way back to 1995, Fire Covenant finds a really, really nice place in this deck. I actually saw Fire Covenant in deck lists for the misbegotten 1v1 commander format that was popular for maybe a couple of months on Magic Online, something like 6 or 7 years ago. Fire Covenant showed up in some of those lists. People were playing it in, I think they were playing it in Kest lists and Brea lists and stuff. And it is just an insane card in this deck. It just gives you the ability to instant speed, blow up 3 creatures. If your opponent is playing any type of creature-based strategy, Fire Covenant's going to become a lot more effective. Of course, we are running Toxic Deluge as well, but Fire Covenant is targeted and instant speed, so you can often just blow their guys up and leave whatever you have in play unmolested. It feels bad to cast something like Toxic Deluge and kill off your own Dark Confidant or something, but no such concerns with Fire Covenant. The life loss is almost always inconsequential unless you're in a situation where they have a bunch of giant things in play, but you would have lost anyway, so you might as well just go to 1 and not die, right? It's better. Not too much else to say, other than the fact that Fire Covenant's value as the game goes longer tends to go down because you tend to deal quite a bit of damage to yourself. So don't hang on to Fire Covenant and take damage from a few creatures trying to get greedy with it. Generally, it's best to just fire it off and kill 2 things rather than trying to be greedy and kill 3 or 4, because sometimes you'll regret it because you'll wind up having to pay way more life than you bargained for, or they'll have like a pump spell and now you've just taken a bunch of damage and the creatures are still out there and so on. Jessica's Will, another completely broken thing that was printed quite recently that cares about commanders being in play. I totally missed this card in the first prototype that I built, but then Nate alerted me to it, and when I went and looked at it online to get one, I noticed it was incredibly expensive, so clearly other people figured out how good it was pretty quickly. You can read it right here. Choose 1. If you control a commander, as you cast a spell, you may choose both, of course, and you've got Rogra in play, so you always choose both. Add 1 red mana for each card in target opponent's hand. Also, exile the top 3 cards of your library. You may play them this turn. So you can often cast Jessica's Will like on turn 1, turn 2, all the time. I play this card a million times on turn 2. And your opponent will have like 5 or 6 or even 7 cards in their hand. You get 7 red mana for 3. Oh, and you also get to exile the top 3 cards of your library, and they're very often artifacts, and you get to play those too. And if one of them is a mana artifact that makes black, you can just cast Tevish Zad on turn 2 off of Jessica's Will, in addition to the card advantage. Card is just totally psychotic, and it's just another one of those effects. You're just shaking your head like, how the hell did this get printed? Kolaghan's Command, another very, very powerful modal spell. We're, of course, going berserk on an artifact kill. This gives you the ability to kill creatures and artifacts. Tons of flexibility. It's one of the very, very few cards that exists in all of Magic that allows you to cause your opponent to discard at instant speed with a spell, which means that you can actually, if your opponent has no cards in hand, you can use this to time walk them in addition to shattering one of their artifacts or killing one of their guys or regrowing something you've got in your graveyard, because you can wait for them to draw the card for their turn and then make them discard it before they get to their main step. So unless they've drawn an instant speed thing, they have to discard it and they're fully boned, and it basically is the time walk effect. One kind of little neat benefit of this card is the fact that after a couple of sacrifices, Rogra's casting cost often gets prohibitively high. You know, it feels really bad to spend 6 mana on a 0/1. And so with Kolaghan's Command, you can let Rogra die and then pop him back into your hand using that top ability, which usually doesn't have a ton of utility. But even though it is 3 mana kill an artifact, and I talked before about how Bedevil feels bad to do that, you're doing something else often at the same time. And those factors alone make the card more than worth including. In the ongoing theme of very, very powerful back-breaking 3 mana planeswalkers, here is the OG. I guess they printed a few other ones. There was like the original Jace, but he never really made a splash. Liliana of the Veil was the first really, truly top-tier, powerful 3 mana planeswalker I think that was ever printed. And she is just an absolute all-star in this deck. The ability to target a player and making them sacrifice a guy means that you can circumvent annoying things like Hexproof and Shroud. And Liliana is one of those things, it's kind of like facing a Jace, where they just play it, they get an effect, and then it's still just there afterward, ready to just wreak havoc on you. And you can play the Thralls off of Tevesh Zat to protect her, and steadily ramp her up. Sure, it makes both players discard, but you have like a very, very powerful and free card drawing engine in your deck. So you can disrupt them while discarding redundant spells, and eventually make your way up to the -6 ability. And the -6 ability comes online pretty quickly, and it is GG. I mean, basically, if you split your opponent's, usually most of the time the split is either one color of mana or the other color of mana, or it's lands versus non-lands. You know, like there's so many splits with Liliana that win you the game. Your opponent just has absolutely no choice. They're completely doomed if they do, doomed if they don't, and that is just absurd value for a planeswalker. You have to invest 3 mana and obviously 3 discards. And don't obviously forget that if you're hellbent at any reason, you shouldn't be hellbent in this deck, even though it is Rakdos. But if you are hellbent, you can +1, play whatever you played for the turn and then +1 her, and you don't actually have to discard, since that's not part of the cost. Necropotence. Any deck with Necro is going to be a good deck. The most powerful black spell ever printed. Maybe that's not true by modern standards. There certainly are some contenders to the throne. I would say that Yawgmoth's Will is up there. I'd certainly say that Ad Nauseam is up there in terms of its ability to shut out the game. But Necro, terrorizing players, particularly control players, since 1995 in its inception. I've played this card more than just about any card that I've played in my entire history as a Magic player. And I'd probably say it's my second favorite card in the entire game outside of Mana Drain. And super, super insane in this deck too. There are plenty of games where it feels almost redundant, which seems absurd. And you're actually not playing Necro because there's other things to do. And that's kind of a testament to just how utterly broken and insane Bullszat actually is. Any deck that makes Necro feel like kind of clunky and weak sometimes is probably a little too strong. The fact that it makes it feel almost obsolete. That's not to say that the card isn't totally nuts in here, and it'll be a card that you're frequently tutoring for and ramping out quickly and casting. Be wary of casting it too quickly, though. And I would say that one of the reasons is because you're not setting up some big, powerful combo the way that you are in, for example, a Zur deck, where you're just trying to close out the game on the following turn. This deck doesn't have really any of those cards or conditions in it, which means that be a little bit more conservative about over-necroing, unless you're facing a board state that you absolutely have to answer that turn. And I often find that I'm not over-necroing by more than maybe like 1 to 2 cards. Usually when I'm anticipating getting a couple of lands in my hand and I can throw one of them away, and I want to make sure that I just have one land in my hand, but I'm not doing the behavior that I would do in the Zur deck, where I just play Necro and Necro for 25 immediately, because you have so much kind of uniformity and homogeneity throughout the spells in your deck. And usually some nice section of 5 or 6 cards will kind of do what you need to do, and you've got all these other card advantage engines online and running anyway, and that means you don't want to be just biting off big chunks of your deck and throwing them into exile. Opposition agent. God, man. Well, they kept one half of the degenerate breacher agent combo around. And this guy is, I mean, I still am just shaking my head at his design and wondering how a card like this could ever get made, given the fact that tutoring is such a main part of what you do in Commander, and it's one of the most fun things you do, and it's one of the most skill-testing things you do. And having a 3-mana flash creature that absolutely punishes that mechanic until it's answered is just insane. Now, keep in mind, of course, not only do we have all the acceleration in the deck, but we've also got both Dark Ritual and Culling the Weak, and you can often flash out Opposition Agent right on turn 1 if you play Rogue Ra to just kill your opponent whenever they try to do anything. And I've actually done that a good number of times. I've certainly blown games wide open by mid-game, and yeah, he's just totally nuts. And, I mean, considering the other things that have been banned in Commander, like the Prophet of Krufix, Sylvan Primordial, 7 mana, 6/8. Like, this guy's 3 mana. Nobody at the board gets to tutor except for you, and you get to steal their tutors at instant speed. And people constantly do tutoring things anyway with Opposition Agent in play. I've had that happen so many times, where the guy gets screwed, his fetch land gets screwed, and I steal his land, and then the next turn he casts Kodama's Reach or something, and then concedes, obviously, after realizing that just gives me 2 lands as well. Totally broken, insane card, and one of the best black spells printed ever. Certainly one of the best black creatures ever made. Is there a better black creature than this guy? Is Dark Confidant better than him? I don't know. It might be the best black creature ever printed. All right. Sword of Feast and Famine. I will admit that we had no swords in the deck for a long time, and after continuing to brainstorm, Nate suggested running both Sword of Feast and Famine and Sword of Fire and Ice, and I had this version of the deck built until very recently, literally today actually, with both swords in it. But Nate's extensive testing and his feedback indicated that Sword of Fire and Ice was a little bit on the clunky side. He was having a hard time really getting the ability to trigger, and even when it triggered, it wasn't really that impactful. I really liked it because the 2 damage allows you to interact directly with creatures, and obviously interact directly with planeswalkers, and that felt pretty solid to me. Pro red is pretty good, pro blue decent, and obviously the card draw is really good, but it doesn't do anything that really feels profoundly unfair, and that makes it very, very different from Sword of Feast and Famine, which is really just a totally insane unfair effect. It allows you to, of course, cheat with Winter Orb. It puts tons of pressure on your opponent's hand. And as I mentioned before, one of the big failing points of this deck is the opponent who just kind of has a bunch of stuff in play and is able to accumulate some resistance in their hand and get a combo sculpted together, often involving either Underworld Breach and Brainstorm, or using, of course, the ubiquitous Thassa's Oracle bullshit. And if your opponent is having to discard a card every single turn and they have no cards in hand, they can't really put that combo together, short of something like Yawgmoth's Will. And the extra mana generation that it creates, the evasion in the form of pro-black and pro-green is really, really impactful in Commander. And those things alone, I think, make the card good enough. And you'd think, wait a minute, this deck is nearly creatureless. What are you doing running swords? Well, we have a 0-mana Kobold with Menace. So you can just get through with Sword of Feast and Famine on Rogue Ra really quickly. And the amount of times where you just have a sorted creature attacking in a nearly creatureless deck is pretty astonishing. And that makes it, I think, well worth using, and still clearly the best of all the swords. Toxic Deluge, best removal spell in all of Commander. Nothing is even close in terms of its compactability to kill literally everything, and doesn't care about destruction, bypasses regeneration, kills stuff of any size. Obviously, you lose life, but I mean, come on, who cares, right? It's paying some modest amount of life to kill off innumerable threats, and is the best universal removal spell that's probably ever been printed in the history of the game. Yawgmoth's Will. So I was talking before about cards that are potentially competitive with Necropotence for top of the heap. I know that Yawgmoth's Will, I think, was the #1 black card that was listed when the big 100 best Magic cards of all time. I guess it was a crowdsourced event or whatever, crowd knowledge, whatever you'd call that. But basically a huge sampling of Magic players from all over the world voted for their top 100 cards. And those cards were revealed during a panel at Magic Fest 2018. I actually sat in on a couple of those panels. And I think actually Yawgmoth's Will was mentioned in the panel that I was sitting on. And it was, I believe, the best black card. I mean, of course, in formats with tons of pure degeneracy like Black Lotus and Lion's Eye Diamond and stuff, the card is totally nuts, Lotus Petal and stuff. But there's a lot of effects like that in this deck too. It gives you the ability to replay so many of the singleton effects. Definitely one of the most strong black cards in all of Commander, and shines incredibly well in this deck as well. And don't be afraid to play Yawgmoth's Will early. A lot of people will hold on to the card thinking, like, I got to get crazy value out of this, but I can't tell you the number of games where I've just played Yawgmoth's Will in turn 3 to get a fetch land or something. Or I've played it maybe just to get a 2-for-1, you know, get a fetch land and play some 1-mana artifact or something from the graveyard, or a 0-mana artifact. And I mentioned before about how sometimes you'll let Rogra go to the graveyard in order to bring it back with Kolaghan's Command. Yawgmoth's Will is another way to do that. And by mid-game, sometimes it does make sense to just have Rogra hanging around the graveyard, particularly if you are setting up Yawgmoth's Will, because you can bring him back also. All right, that I believe is the end of the 3s. We are nearing the end of the spells already, actually. It shows you can just see this giant pile over here. This is all the stuff costing 3 or less. That is most of the spells in the deck. That's over 50 cards, I think. So you can see how just low the mana curve is. Chandra, Torch of Defiance, one of the few cards we have in the deck that's double red. And Nate, after doing a bunch of testing, started saying, hey, do we really need Chandra in the deck? And I think that the answer is yes. I think that Chandra has enough versatile modes. It's card advantage, it's mana generation, it's direct damage, and it is also a finisher, inevitability. The ability to just ramp her up a bunch. Again, Planeswalkers are really, really resilient in this deck. It's very, very hard to kill them. And as a result of that, you can often tick Chandra up to 7, ultimate her, and the game is just instantly over. And her other abilities are nuts, honestly. The 2-mana generation is insane. You can just do it on the turn that she comes into play to make her effectively cost just 2 mana. You often just play her and kill a creature, and then she's hanging out. Just in the same fashion as Jace comes down and bounces a thing, and now you still got to deal with him. She draws cards. And sure, she's got a bit of a clunky casting cost, but I think it's so much value for 4 mana that the card is more than worth it in here. And I'm very seldom unhappy to have it. And it's elicited tons and tons of concessions as well. And that's generally a sign of a card that probably belongs in your deck. Deadly Rollick. Yet another card that takes advantage of the fact that you have a 0-mana commander. 4 mana instant speed, exile a creature. Totally amazing. Honestly, not even a bad effect even for just 4 mana. But when you have a 0-mana Rogra sitting in play, 0 mana, exile a creature, pretty damn good effect, and obviously belongs in the deck 100%. I wanted to mention, though, that other people have built other versions of Tavish Zat, and they've used some other commanders. I've seen Vial Smasher versions. I've seen there's like a blue-black partner creature that has been paired with him. I've seen him paired with Timna, seen him paired with Kraum. And whenever you're playing with any of those more expensive commanders, sure, they seem like they add some more value, but suddenly you're staring at your Deadly Rollick, and you need to be able to kill something on turn 1, like a Serra Ascendant or a Weathered Wayfarer, who knows, Dark Confidant, whatever, and you can't do it because you don't have any ability to get your commander into play. It's so different mechanically to have access to a 0-mana commander to turn on all of these free commander checking based spells. And I think that's one of the primary reasons why Rogra, I mean, you've seen other reasons, obviously, I've made plenty of justifications, but that's one of the primary reasons I think why Rogra is the best partner for Tevesh. Fiery Confluence. This is another card that was everywhere in that old 1v1 Magic Online format, and it is super insane in this deck too. The ability to, great modal abilities, the ability to surgically kind of deal damage to the board, kill off a lot of things without targeting, and of course the triple shatter is one of the primary reasons why we play it. It is a sorcery. I find that regrettable and a little weird, honestly, based on some of the other cards that are like this. It seems strange that it's sorcery speed. But that said, sorcery speed to triple shatter, amazing. And sometimes you can just go and deal. You can deal 1 damage to each creature twice and then destroy an artifact, or deal 1 damage to all the token creatures in play and kill 2 artifacts and stuff. It's modal enough, powerful enough to be worth using. It was out of the deck a couple of times, I think, but inevitably Nate would have some game where he was just struggling against numerous amounts of artifacts and wishing that he had the effect. And I think that having just more things that are like Shatterstorm in this format is pretty damn important. And in that same vein, we've got Karn the Great Creator. 4 mana, null rod for all of your opponent's artifacts. So devastating. He does have this +1 ability also where you can turn an artifact into a creature with power toughness equal to its CMC. So that allows you to kill off cards like Mana Crypt, like Mox Diamond, like Jeweled Lotus, Chrome Mox, etc. You can kill those things off just by doing the +1 ability. You also have a number of beefy artifacts in the deck too, and Karn sometimes can just allow you to get an extra blocker or something in a pinch, turn a Thran Dynamo or a Gilded Lotus or something into a big, robust blocker and block something or attack into a Planeswalker to kill it. And that's pretty versatile. It's very unlikely you'll ever get this -2 ability to ever work, given that it only works on artifacts outside the game. So, I mean, I guess there's like some sort of weird world where you have a Skull Clamp that gets exiled by a Bojuka Bog or something in the graveyard, and Karn allows you to get it back. But it's very unlikely that -2 ability is likely to work. What Karn is really in the deck for is just another failsafe against fast degenerate artifact starts, which are it tends to be kind of one of the biggest tipping points and failure points for this strategy, because you don't have counterspells. You can't rein in what they do off the mana. The only way you can really deal with it is to constrain and destroy the mana. And Karn gives you not only an immediate solution to that, but a long-term and semi-permanent solution to that as well if you're able to protect him. Smokestack. God, this card is pure gnarliness. Oh man. Smokestack showed up in those old stacks. Like if you think back to the deck list called Stacks, the sort of all catch-all artifact workshop-based archetype that has been looming large over what was originally, I guess, Type 1 in vintage format for many, many years. And it's funny that a lot of Stacks decks in modern day don't actually run Smokestack, but that's why the deck was actually called Stacks, because it had Smokestacks in it. You would ramp out Smokestack with Mishra's Workshop, play Tanglewire and sack the Tanglewire to Smokestack eventually, and you'd have this Smokestack just sitting in play with 2 soot counters on it, just gobbling up all their permanents, and you'd have Trinispheres and Spheres of Resistance in play, and your opponent is just utterly hopeless. It's one of the most miserable, horrible decks to play against. And anybody that played in that era, I mean, this card dates all the way back to Urza's Saga, so we're talking 1999. Anybody who played in that era hated to face that deck. If you were not playing a critical massive artifact kill, you could not beat it. It was so brutal. And as I said before, over time, Stacks has sort of morphed as they've made more artifact things, more things to do with lots of artifact mana. We didn't actually have Smokestack in the deck until fairly recently, but this was another card that Nate sort of touched upon because he was, again, struggling to win these mid to long games where he would dominate the early game and get a lot of card advantage, but the lack of counterspells meant that his opponent could still just top deck his way out of the situation. He could draw ad nauseum and draw a million cards. He could draw Necro, he could draw Twister or Wheel or Windfall or any number of different things and just immediately be right back into the game and win via combo. And Smokestack gives you the ability to lock the game up. You basically play Smokestack early, and do not be afraid to play this card on turn 2. Because keep in mind that adding the soot counters is discretionary, and it happens after you provided you stack it properly. It happens after you resolve the permanent sacrificing effect. So the first person who pays the Smokestack tax is them, and you can actually, and eventually, if you really want to, you can sacrifice the Smokestack to itself once it's eaten up their entire board. But of course, if you have Tevesh Zad in play, you can pretty easily and readily ramp Smokestack up to 2 or even 3 counters. And you're sacking 2 Thralls to it every turn, and they're sacking 3 permanents to it every turn. And I think you can probably figure out who wins that battle. Smokestack just gives you a lot of flexibility, a lot of ability to sort of take command of the mid-game when things tend to often go awry. And I think that alone, and the fact that it's so easy to get into play and so easy to leverage and abuse it, and it's discretionary, makes it more than worthy of inclusion. This is a big mana deck, and of course, this is one of the best big mana artifacts ever printed. Thran Dynamo literally won a Pro Tour around the time. This is like Urza's Destiny. I remember watching Kai Buddha use Thran Dynamos in his big Covetous Dragon deck to crush people, and the card has been incredibly powerful in all the formats where it's been legal ever since. I really think Thran Dynamo is actually incredibly underplayed in Commander in general. You see Gilded Lotus a fair amount. You don't see Thran Dynamo nearly as much, and most people just tend to play the 2s. They just tend to play Signets. This card is insane. Like, you play it on turn 2 or turn 3, sometimes even turn 1 off something like a Workshop, and it's 3 mana a turn. That's just ridiculous. And is perfectly situated in this deck because it's such a big mana deck. So love to have Thran Dynamo in here. All right, that's the last 4. We've moved on to the 5s ad nauseum. And in my opinion, I think in terms of competitive commander, this card is right near the top of the list for cards that I would absolutely, if I had full reign of the format and the ability to curate the banned list myself, I think that ad nauseum would very likely be one of my candidates for removal. I think the card is just, the best decks don't tend to run spells that cost anything. So this card doesn't really have a drawback, and it's instant speed. If it were sorcery, it'd be another thing entirely. I can't tell you how many games though where you just, one of the players just cast ad nauseum during the other guy's end step, and that's it. You just draw 20, untap, and win. And I think that that's just kind of stupid for a 5-mana spell that's instant speed in a format where things that cost 5 of power level that's like hysterically weaker, like 100th as weak, are banned. Like getting back to the Prophet of Krufix and other cards that they ban. I mean, honestly, Paradox Engine costs 5. That's banned too, right? What would you rather face, Paradox Engine or ad nauseum? I can tell you which one I'd rather play against 100 out of 100 times. The card is just broken and stupid, and it's another one of those cards that your opponents will allow your opponents back into the game that they have no business winning. You know, you'll have them completely dominated, and you're a million cards ahead, and then at the end of your turn, they cast ad nauseum, or the demonic tutor for it, or the imperial seal for it, or whatever, and they play ad nauseum, and because you're not playing a deck that deals tons of damage, they're at 36, and they flip over 27 spells or something, or 27 cards or something, and they're at 3, and then you're dead. And there's a lot of games that are like that, and that's one of the reasons why we're running cards like Smokestack, for example. Smokestack prevents the ad nauseum comeback. Of course, if you're one of the ways to also counteract ad nauseum is to play it yourself. And most of the time you'll play this and probably draw anywhere from maybe 14 to 18, maybe around 20 cards with it total. And of course they're revealed, so it bypasses the things that constrain card draw as well. It's reveal and put the card into your hand. And if you can't win the game after revealing and essentially drawing 20 cards, then you're probably just doing it wrong. So one of the most powerful cards in the deck, and shines in this deck as well. Gilded Lotus, more big mana stuff. We love this card, of course. Any deck with Mishra's access to Mishra's Workshop should be playing Gilded Lotus, and a lot of decks that aren't playing it should be playing it as well. A lot of people have sort of keyed in on the card. It's certainly better in blue, where you have multiple ways to copy it. You can copy it via copy artifact or metamorph. But even a single Gilded Lotus, super insane, and makes the Mishra's Workshop a really good target for both tutors and for Expedition Map early on. All right, there's just a couple of 5s. We've moved on to the, I believe, Soul 6, God Pharaoh's Statue. This is another card I never ever would have considered, although Nate and I had a long conversation about possibly including Nether Void in the deck, because again, he was struggling particularly with Underworld Breach combos. There's a ridiculous combo involving Underworld Breach and the card Brain Freeze, because you can cast a few spells and then Brain Freeze yourself, which puts a whole bunch of stuff in the graveyard, 18 or 21 cards or something. And then you have Underworld Breach in play, so you can play the copy of Brain Freeze from the graveyard by removing 3 cards to Brain Freeze yourself again, which puts another, 2x number of cards in the graveyard, somewhere of 30 or 35 or 40 cards in the graveyard. And now you have more than enough fuel to cast Brain Freeze over and over and over again on your opponent to immediately deck them, because it doesn't exile the card from the game. So we were looking for solutions to that, because that was another way that Nate kept losing in games where he was just totally ahead and the guy would just get that 2-card combo and it would be over. And he touched upon the idea of using God Pharaoh's Statue, and it just turns out that we're running a deck with Workshop, tons of artifact mana acceleration, tons of rituals, all sorts of ways to get God Pharaoh's Statue into play quickly. And if you're able to play God Pharaoh's Statue like turn 2, turn 3, what the hell are they going to do? I mean, think about how bad it is facing something like Rhystic Study, where it's discretionary to pay 1 extra mana a turn. This is mandatory. All your shit costs 2 extra mana to play forever until you deal with it, and it's a 6-mana artifact. It not only sets your opponent back completely, but it often just completely puts them out of the game entirely. And there's no comboing your way around into a win generally when God Pharaoh's Statue is in play. In fact, even the extremely compact and lethal combo of Demonic Consultation and Thassa's Oracle, costing only 3 normally, This adds 4 extra mana to that, so it costs 7. And 7 mana combos, there's lots of ways to win the game for 7 mana. It's much more reasonable. Sure, they can still kill you, but if you have God Pharaoh's statue in play, you know that they can't combo off with less than 7 mana in play, and so you can play a game plan accordingly and just keep them below 7, and they don't have any way to actually deploy that entire combo in one turn. And that flexibility alone probably warrants the inclusion of the card. Another card here, I don't have one with me, unfortunately, but I mentioned before the 6 mana Ugin. Nate is currently trying that out right now in the 6 mana slot. So it may find its way into the deck, but I doubt, even if it does, that it will displace the God Pharaoh statue. I think this card is more than powerful enough, and particularly in terms of what this deck is trying to do, it makes a ton of sense. Imagine playing this with like Winter Orb or with Smokestack in play. It's so delicious. Okay, on to the X spells, and then we're going to be ready for the lands. First one of these is By Force, another Shatterstorm style effect, scaling, also very similar in power level to Shattering Spree, and obviously with the only drawback that you can't play it on turn 1, but it ramps pretty effectively. And 2 mana kill a Soul Ring, 2 mana kill a Mana Crypt, not too bad. And often you're paying 3 mana to kill 2 things. Sometimes you're breaking 5 or 6 artifacts at a time. It's definitely not on the power level of those other cards, but I think it's better than something that would be a singular effect like a Shattering Spree. We looked at a bunch of other effects. We're not running something like Ingot Chewer at 1 red, mainly because Ingot Chewer is just so bad if you're not doing just that thing. Like a 5 mana 3/3 is just so garbage. But there's lots of other things at 2 mana. There's Shredded Sails is an interesting artifact kill spell. There's You Find Some Prisoners, which is actually sitting to my left here, and it was cut just kind of tonight after hopping in and out of the deck a bunch of times. I don't think that You Find Some Prisoners is a bad card by any measure, and it has some really neat extra flexibility against things like tutors, of course, opposing tutors. And in a pinch, you can often use it to just exile the top 3 cards of your opponent's library to try to get a mana source if you really need that. I actually had a game just yesterday where that was decisive. But overall, I think that those 2 mana artifact kill spells that only kill 1 thing are inferior to By Force, even though By Force is sorcery speed. The fact that it can scale, and you're very often in problematic situations where you are facing down 2 to 3 mana-based artifacts, and because so much of our containment plan is about destroying artifacts, this card really makes a lot of sense and belongs in the deck. Even in 1v1, certainly much better in multiplayer. All right, Death Cloud. I completely missed this card too when I was building the deck for the first time. And as soon as Nate showed it to me in his list, my jaw dropped and I went, oh my God, that is the perfect finisher for Bullszat. It is so good. And I would say that if you play this deck a bunch of times, you will find that a majority of your games that end via any method but concession, just to inevitability, end at the hands of Death Cloud. Although I guess technically that's still concession because it's very rare when you just literally kill your opponent with it. But the fact that it's so funny to cast this spell, because you'll often see people online, you'll cast Death Cloud and you'll see them go, okay, well, I've only got 2 cards in my hand. That's not too bad. Oh shit, my creatures are dead. Oh wait, all my lands are dead too, and I have nothing in play anymore. And meanwhile, my opponent has 2 planeswalkers and 4 mana artifacts. And that's sort of what Death Cloud does. You just play this card. It's so easy to leverage situations where Death Cloud is almost completely one-sided. Sure, you discard your hand. Sure, you lose 2 or 3 lands in play. But the after effects of it, the board state in the aftermath of Death Cloud, is them completely, utterly helpless. No cards in hand, no mana production, no creatures, nothing, just dead. And that's, I mean, really what else can you ask for in a finisher? I'd say that the range that you tend to cast Death Cloud in is usually around 3 to 4, but don't be afraid to cast it for 2. You have the ability to get it back later on via Yawgmoth's Will if you need to, and sometimes even a 2 mana early Death Cloud just to completely cripple the opponent, make them discard, kill off the first 2 things they played, maybe their commanders or something, and destroying 2 of their lands after you've killed some of their artifacts is often enough to just make the game decisive. But by the time you're casting this card for 3 or 4 or 5 mana, it is almost always just game over. It's that powerful, that insane, and I've developed a huge amount of respect for the card. I've seen it in lists over the years. It's shown up in various deck lists over time, but I've never really played with the card, and having won at this point dozens and scores of games with it has really given me a profound respect for it. I quite love it. Death Cloud. I've certainly won my fair share of games with good old-fashioned Mind Twist. Of course, crushing opponents, driving them mad since mid-1993. This deck is no exception. One of the most powerful black spells ever printed. Certainly one of the most powerful black spells available in Commander, not at its absolute best in multiplayer, but in 1v1, Mind Twist is just off the charts insane. And particularly in this deck where you have so many insane 4, 5, 6 mana starts. Nate showed me a hand earlier today that was just about to begin, and he had Culling the Weak, 2 black lands, Mana Crypt, and Mind Twist in his opening hand, which is Mind Twist for 5 on turn 1 going first, which is something you really shouldn't be able to do outside of something like Vintage or Old School, maybe once in a blue moon. The fact that that can happen in Commander is pretty absurd, although he ultimately didn't even wind up doing that. He went turn 1, Culling the Weak, into Demonic Tutor, because he had that in his hand, into Soul Ring, into Tavish Zat, untap, and Mind Twist for the guy's hand off of one of the lands, the City of Traders. So he did pretty much the second thing. I guess he just wasn't facing blue in that game, so the imperative to Mind Twist turn 1 didn't matter. Either way, nuts card. All right, Shatter Skull Smashing. So they printed a whole bunch of these weird modal flip cards, which are, of course, lands on the other side. You can see it right here. This is Shatter Skull, the Hammer Pass. So you can pay 3 life to play it as a mountain, or it can come into play tapped. And that's, I'd say that probably 98% of the time you're just playing this card as a mountain. But the fact that it's a red source that costs you 3 life, which is generally inconsequential, and it has this extra flexibility. Shatter Skull Smashing deals X damage divided as you choose among up to 2 target creatures and or planeswalkers. That's the key right there. It deals damage to planeswalkers, which of course, as a red-black deck, you struggle to do unless you're playing pure burn spells. And of course, if you spend a ton of mana, it doubles the amount of damage you're dealing. So it's like a mediocre mountain and a mediocre removal spell that can deal with planeswalkers, but combined, the fact that it doesn't really cost you anything more than warrants the inclusion of the card. And I think that it's a no-brainer inclusion in here. Even though you don't have a ton of use for red mana, I have cast my fair share of Shatter Skull Smashings to kill a bunch of creatures or even kill 2 planeswalkers in play. And I think the card is more than enough flexibility at the cost of playing with, essentially what is a mountain. All right. And I guess Shadow Skull Smashing is technically a spell, but that brings us to the end of the spells. I'm going to go through the lands now. My build actually has a total of 30 land. I believe Nate is playing with 29. 30 plus the Shadow Skull Smashing, other side, which is technically 31. Nate is currently playing with 29 lands, so our decks are 1 card different. I'm nervous about going down below 30 lands. Maybe he's correct. Time will tell. I'll leave that up to you. But first land, Ancient Tomb, of course, one of the most powerful lands ever printed, certainly in Commander, where the life loss is almost inconsequential. And you'll almost always be happy to get that in your opening hand. Here's the first of the red-only fetch lands. There are 2 primary targets for Arid Mesa. That'll be the Badlands and the Blood Crypt. Speaking of Badlands, there's a beautiful Beta Badlands sitting right on top. And don't always go get Badlands early when you're fetching, particularly if you expect early removal from your opponent. It's sometimes correct actually to go and get basic lands early, depending on the rest of your hand. And in the same vein as when you're playing Old School, it's not always correct to play Library of Alexandria on turn 1 because your opponent might be playing with 4 strip mines, and if they do, they'll often strip mine the first couple lands you play, and then you play your Library of Alexandria, and they have no answer to it. And Badlands is kind of the same way. Obviously, you play this card if you need the black and red mana right away, but sometimes leaving it in your deck, as it's so flexible with its interactions with all your fetch lands, is quite important, because it's possible, if you remove Badlands and Blood Crypt and the single mountain from your deck, that you can draw Arid Mesa or the Wooded Foothills later and not have anything you can fetch with it. So don't get Badlands unless you absolutely need to, even though it's fun to flex with revised or beta or alpha lands. All right, Barbarian Ring. This is another Nate innovation. I love having the card in the deck. In fact, he actually tried out the Cabal Pit, I think it's called too, the black version of this. But ultimately, we just settled on Barbarian Ring. It does 1 damage to you. Sure, that sucks. It only makes red. That kind of sucks too. But the ability to deal 2 damage to target creature or player, that's actually been errated. It deals 2 damage to any target now with the new templating. And that means that you have the ability to kill planeswalkers with it. And there's lots of horrible planeswalkers you do not want to face with this deck. And having more planeswalker interaction is incredibly important. I already mentioned that with Shatter Skull Smashing and cards like Angrath's Rampage and Dreadbore stuff. And you don't want to lose to like a Narset or something. You've got your whole engine set up, and the guy's got this pesky Narset just sitting there with 1 counter on it. You can't get rid of it, and you can't draw extra cards to get out of the situation, and you just wind up losing to it. And Barbarian Ring gives you a very innocuous way to deal with that. And of course, because of Crucible of Worlds and sometimes even Yawgmoth's Will, you can double Barbarian Ring something even bigger. I think that's more than worth the cost of having a land that hurts you a little bit and only makes red. Blackcleave Cliffs, just a very, very nice, flexible red-black dual land. Sure, it's not a swamp or a mountain, but big majority of the time, this card will come into play untapped and be just interchangeable with one of those. Another card that's very similar to that is the Blightstep Pathway. It has no limitation of ever entering play tapped. Nearly every time you play this card, you're going to be playing it as a swamp or as a black producer. Every now and then it'll be producing red. That's the other side of it. For people who aren't familiar with the card, Seer Step Pathway is the other side. But overall, the flexibility more than warrants inclusion. I've got Blood Crypt, the shock land that's just the Badlands equivalent, and fetchable in the same conditions that I mentioned before. Bloodstained Mire, best fetch land in the deck. Got a City of Brass here, an Arabian Nights one. And even though it's a two-color deck, don't discount how often you will be bereft of the other color or missing double black or double red. And so every dual land that doesn't absolutely suck, like, I don't know, something like Undiscovered Paradise should be in your deck, provided that it comes into play untapped and doesn't have a drawback. The life loss is inconsequential. Got City of Traders, and this is another card that actually it took a little convincing for me to play it. Nate loves City of Traders. He's put it in tons of decks, including decks where it probably doesn't belong, like Brea, given the color requirements of that deck. But this deck is very, very generic mana hungry, and City of Traders is incredible. You can play it on turn one sometimes to even just ramp out a Signet and leave it in play for a couple turns, or you can play it sort of as the very tail end of your top end. You play land, City of Traders, play something on 4, and then next turn you can tap it again, replace it, and cast a Tevesh Zat. And having gotten 4 or 6 mana out of it more than makes up for the fact that you lose the card. In the same vein as a card like Gemstone Mine. Command Tower, obviously no-brainer inclusion in every deck. All right, that leads us to Dust Bowl. So this card was actually added kind of in the same time frame as when we were looking for kind of longer-term solutions to win those long, grindy matches. And it doesn't seem all that great on the surface, particularly because we're not running a ton of land. But very often, it's just about containing him for a few turns. And we have so much artifact suppression. Being able to kill off key colors or being able to kill off a couple of lands, particularly if something like Winter Orb is in play or if you've got Smokestack running, Dust Bowl can really seal up the game. And I think that even though I was a little reluctant to play it, given the fact that it does just make generic mana, I think that you have enough redundancy in the mana sources in the deck that you can probably get away with playing the card. And its top end potential is very, very high. And you have the ability to sometimes just elicit concessions with Dust Bowl that no other card would really do outside of something more complicated and fragile like Crucible Strip Mine. Graven Cairns. Fantastic card. I've actually tutored for this card a number of times in order to get that access to double red. And it's really, really nice having a card that can convert all black mana into double red, particularly if you're fueling a card like Shattering Spree. And that opportunity alone, in addition to the fact that it's just, all the regular filter flexibility, makes the card well worth it. Just City of Brass number 2. Here's another black fetch. That's one of them. And Mighty Mishra's Workshop. Seems like every deck that we play that's good just uses Workshop. I mean, obviously the card is underplayed in real Magic by nature of the fact that it's something like $2,500 or even higher depending on the condition. It's very, very cheap in Magic Online, and I actually don't see it nearly as much as I'd expect. But this is 100% one of the best Workshop-based decks that I've ever seen in the format, and a card that you will be tutoring for and mapping for all the time. Single Basic Mountain, which we have in there just not only because of things like Path to Exile, but also because of the fact that you need more sources of fetchable red in case you happen to get both the Badlands and the Blood Crypt out of your deck and you draw the Arid Mesa or the Wooded Foothill. So having that third mountain is really nice. It feels so nice tutoring for it when you're thinking, oh shit, do I even have any targets left? Oh yeah, I still have the Basic Mountain in there, which is really nice. So I've got one copy of Basic Mountain, probably about the perfect number. I would not play with more than that. Phyrexian Tower, this is another card that we took a little while. In fact, I had this in the very, very first prototype of of the deck and then cut it because at the time we just didn't have enough ways. First of all, the deck was way more dependent on using Rogue Ra to sacrifice to Tevesh Zat to get going. and we had many fewer reasons to actually have Rogra in play. We didn't have Curse of Opulence, we didn't have the Tome, we didn't have Sword of Feast and Famine. There just weren't as many reasons to have Rogra in play attacking, and that meant that he would be sacrificed over and over and over again to Tevesh Zat, which would mean that the tower didn't really have anything to kill. And you didn't really want to kill Rogra with the tower, because if they counterspelled or removed your Planeswalker right away, you would kind of essentially 2-for-1 yourself. But over time, as the deck has become more willing to sacrifice Rogra early, and to get more leverage in the game, the tower has become increasingly more powerful. And I think it's fantastic. It just enables more degenerate broken starts. All right, another great fetch land, Blue to Delta. Rishadan Port, or Rishadan Port, probably Rishadan. Another card that took some convincing for me to want to put in the deck, but other people have been actually playtesting as well. I've got a number of other friends. My good friend Eric and my other friend Michael have both been playing Bullszat a ton, and Eric just took down a really, really big, like a 60-person competitive tournament down in California at a shop there. Really high dollar value, high prominence commander event that attracts a ton of players and a lot of esteem and a lot of really skilled people. And I talked to him about Rishadan Port also. He ran it, and both he and Nate were very, very bullish on the card and said there's many, many situations where this card comes up and you really are very happy to have it, just to have surgical mana denial on your opponents. It also, of course, combines incredibly well with Winter Orb. If you get Winter Orb plus a mana artifact and Rishadan Port, you can just lock your opponent out of the game forever if you're able to suppress their artifacts. And that's probably more than enough value for a generic, a thing that only makes generic mana. I cut a Swamp for this. A little reluctant, but I mean, if you look at the deck, it does seem like it really does have enough redundancy in black, and not a huge, huge black mana requirement. And that probably alone is enough to warrant the Port being in there. Scalding Tarn, another thing that fetches Badlands. Strip Mine, of course, the best land destruction card ever printed, and another reason why Crucible of Worlds is so good in the deck. Be leery of playing Strip Mine super early, though, right? Be surgical and tactical with it. Pay attention to your opponent's mana, and always, of course, be looking for opportunities to switch into the Strip Mine-based game, particularly if you're able to contain their artifacts. The Strip Mine gets way, way more powerful, and you can start really pushing in the direction of trying to do recursive stuff with the Crucible. Sulphur Springs, just a good black-red Painland, OG Painland from Ice Age, with that cool little picture. One basic swamp, a second basic swamp, and that's all the basic swamps. I originally had, I think, 5 in my prototype, then 4, then 3, and now 2. Nate, I believe, is only playing a single basic swamp, which I think is just a little too scary for my taste, given the fact that there's cards like Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon and Back to Basics and stuff floating around in the format. I'm a little reluctant to cut that many from the deck, but maybe he's right. However, this card, Urza's Saga, I talked a bunch about this card earlier on in the video, seemingly like 3 days ago, and yeah, I still can't say enough good things about it. I mean, honestly, I can't believe this card got made. It is so utterly ridiculous. Every part of this, short of just making generic mana, is bonkers. Like the ability to just make constructs that are huge off of a land, and you can do it twice. I don't know how familiar people are with sagas, but it says after your draw step, which means the beginning of your main step, add a lore counter and then sacrifice at 3. So the card will endure into the next turn before it transitions, and the transition thing triggers at the beginning of the main step after the draw step. What that means is that you can actually, once it's on stage 2, at the end of your opponent's turn, you can make a construct, and you can untap, stack the transition to phase 3, and then make another construct before it goes away, and then get the artifact also. Or you can, if you decide not to get the second construct, you can just tap it for mana and float that mana into your main step as well, because it keeps the other ability. So the ability to make 2 gigantic constructs, I don't even know if it was intended to be that way, because that's just, the functionality is nuts, particularly in an artifact-based deck, and the fact that you can just make 2 10/10s or something off of a land that your opponent can't counter or interact with is totally insane. And of course, as far as what you're searching for, huge majority of the time you're getting Soul Ring. Sometimes you'll get a more flexible mana source like a Chrome Mox or a Mox Opal or a Mox Diamond. But very frequently, I'd say a good maybe 20-30% of the time, you're in mid-game and you're getting Skull Clamp and you're winning the game on the spot with it, because you have you have Bullszat running, and now you can draw 4 extra cards a turn for 2 mana. The card is unbelievably flexible. You can get it back with both Crucible of Worlds and with, and you can get it back, of course, with Yawgmoth's Will. And as the deck continues to evolve, I'd imagine that Urza's Saga will get continuously better. It's possible, depending on your metagame, you might want to run a card like Relic of Progenitus in your deck. Tons of justification to play with Pithing Needle, and Saga gets both of those as well. The card is just amazing, totally amazing, very high skill testing card, one of the most powerful lands ever printed, and phenomenally strong in this deck too. Got Verdant Catacombs, another black fetch. Wasteland, don't need to really talk about that. Oh my god, there's only 2 cards left. Wooded Foothills, and the final land in the deck, Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. So amazing in this deck as well, as really in any deck with a big black component. Gives you the ability to turn things like Mishra's Workshops into black producers. The deck actually has quite a bit of generic mana-producing lands, so the Urborg really, really shines in here. Even though you don't have tons of double and triple black mana requirements, you've got Necropotence, and of course Deathclad. But outside of that, there aren't really a ton of things that require tons of black. Not running Cabal Coffers, for example. But the card is more than good enough to warrant inclusion despite those exceptions, and you're seldom unhappy to have it. And that, my friends, is the end of the deck tech. Let's go back to the beginning here. Back to our 2 buddies. 98 cards. Cards number 99 and 100, Rogra, Son of Roga, and Bullszat, Doom of Fools. These 2 guys partnered together to provide the backbone of what I can say unequivocally is the strongest competitive commander deck that I have ever piloted and ever had a role in creating. I wanted to extend my thanks. I know I've talked about him a lot, but I wanted to extend tremendous thanks to my very, very good friend and playtest partner and collaborator, Nate Prodzik. If you haven't seen or you're not familiar with his YouTube channel, I strongly recommend going over there. He's been posting hundreds of games with this deck over the last couple of months as he's continued to refine it. And Nate has objectively contributed to the design far more than I have, actually. I built the original prototype. Nate has done all of the heavy lifting and all of the testing, and deserves the lion's share of the credit for how good this deck really is. Also want to extend thanks to my friends Michael and Eric down in California for their contributions and feedback, and of course preemptively to anybody else who might have some ideas about cards we might have missed or directions that we could go in refining Bullszat to make it even more absurd, broken, and unfair than it already is. That is the end of the deck tech, guys. Really, really hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for tuning in and for sticking with me for what is now an hour and 51 minutes of talking nonstop. Hope it was worth it, and hope to see you soon. I'll be debuting videos of this deck in action on my channel. I've got a bunch in my pipeline that I've been saving because I wanted to do the deck tech first. So stay tuned for those. They should be coming up in the next week or so, and there will definitely be more after that. Take care, everyone. See you all later.